Hello and welcome. My name is Alan and we are back with more Greek mythology. Today we're getting into the families of mythology when it comes to Greek mythology. So, anyway, part 5, the great families of mythology. Let's get into this. Chapter 17, the House of Atreus. The chief importance of the story of Atreus and his descendants is that in the 5th century, tragic poet Aeschylus took it for the subject of his great drama, the Oresteia, which made up of 3 plays: the Agamemnon, the Libation Bears, and Eumenides. It has no rival in Greek tragedy except the 4 plays of Sophocles about Oedipus and his children. Pindar in the early 5th century tells the current tale about the feast Tantalus made the gods and protests that it is not true. The punishment of Tantalus is described often. First, in the Odyssey, from which I have taken it, Amphion's story, and Niobe's I have taken from Ovid, who alone tells them in full. For Pelops winning the chariot race, I have preferred Apollodorus of the 1st and 2nd century A.D., who gives the fullest account that has come down to us. The story of Atreus and Thyestes' crimes and all that followed them is taken from Aeschylus' Oresteia. The House of Atreus is one of the most famous families in mythology. Agamemnon, who led the Greeks against Troy, belonged to it. All of his immediate family, his wife Clytemnestra, his children Iphigenia, Orestes, and Electra, were all well known as he was. His brother Menelaus was the husband of Helen of Troy, for whose sake the Trojan War was fought. It was an ill-fated house. The cause of all the misfortunes that was held to be an ancestor, the king of Lydia named Tantalus, who brought upon himself a most terrible punishment by a most wicked deed. That was not the end of the matter. The evil he started went on after his death. His descendants also did wickedly and were punished. A curse seemed to hang over the family, making men sin in spite of themselves and bringing suffering and death down upon the innocent as well as the guilty. Tantalus and Niobe. Tantalus was the son of Zeus and honored by the gods beyond all the mortal children of Zeus. They allowed him to eat at their table, to taste the nectar and ambrosia, which except for him alone none of the immortals could partake of. None but the immortals could partake of. They did more. They came to a banquet in his palace. They condescended to dine with him. In return for their favor, he acted so atrociously that no poet ever tried to explain his conduct. He had his only son Pelops killed, boiled in a great cauldron, and served to the gods. Apparently, he was driven by a passion of hatred against them, which made him willing to sacrifice his own son in order to bring upon them the horror of being cannibals. It may be, too, that he wanted to show in the most startling and shocking way possible how easy it was to deceive the awful, venerated, humbly adored divinities. In his scorn of the gods and his measureless self-confidence, he never dreamed that his guest would realize the manner of food he had set before them. He was a fool. The Olympians knew. They drew back from the horrible banquet, and they turned upon the criminal who had contrived it. He should be so punished, they declared, that no man to come, hearing what this man had suffered, would dare ever again to insult them. They set the arch sinner in a pool in Hades, but whenever in his tormenting thirst he stooped to drink, he could not reach the water. It disappeared, drained into the ground as he bent down. Then he stood up. It was there again. Over the pool, fruit trees hung heavy, laden with pears, pomegranates, rosy apples, sweet figs. Each time he stretched out his hand to grasp them, the wind tossed them high away out of reach. Thus he stood forever, his undying throat always athirst, and his hunger in the midst of plenty never satisfied. His son Pelops was restored to life by the gods, but they had to fashion a shoulder for him out of ivory. One of the goddesses, some say Demeter, some say Thetis, inadvertently had eaten of the loathsome dish, and when the boy's limbs were reassembled, one shoulder was wanting. The ugly story seems to have come down in its early brutal form quite unsoftened. The latter Greeks did not like it and protested against it. The poet Pindar called it a tale decked out with glittering lies against the word of truth. Let a man not speak of cannibal deeds among the blessed gods. However that might be, the rest of Pelops' life was successful. He was the only one of Tantalus' descendants not marked out by misfortune. He was happy in his marriage, although he wooed a dangerous lady who had been the cause of many deaths, the Princess Hippodamia. The reason men died for her was not her own fault, but her father's. This king had a wonderful pair of horses Ares had given him, superior, of course, to all mortal horses. He did not want his daughter to marry, and whenever a suitor came for her hand, the youth was told he could race with her father for her. If the suitor's horses won, she would be his. If her father's won, the suitor must pay with his life for his defeat. In this way, a number of rash young men met their death. Even so, Pelops dared. He had horses he could trust. A present from Poseidon. He won the race, but there is a story that Hippodamia had more to do with the victory than Poseidon's horses. Either she fell in love with Pelops, or she felt the time had come to put a stop to that sort of racing. She bribed her father's charioteer, a man named Myrtilus, to help her. He pulled out the bolts that held the wheels of the king's chariot, and the victory was Pelops with no trouble at all. Later, Myrtilus was killed by Pelops, cursing him as he died, and some said that this was the cause of the misfortunes that afterward followed the family. But most writers said, and certainly with better reason, that it was the wickedness of Tantalus which doomed his descendants. None of them suffered a worse doom than his daughter Niobe, and yet it seemed at first that the gods had chosen her out for good fortune, as they had her brother Pelops. She was happy in her marriage. Her husband was Amphion, a son of Zeus and an incomparable musician. He and his twin brother Zethus undertook once to fortify Thebes, building a lofty wall around it. Zethus was a man of great physical strength who despised his younger brother's neglect of manly sports and his devotion to his art. Yet, when it came to the heavy task of getting enough rocks for the wall, the gentle musician outdid the strong athlete. He drew such entrancing sounds from his lyre that the very stones were moved and followed him to Thebes. There he and Niobe ruled in entire content, until she showed that the mad arrogance of Tantalus lived on in her. She held herself raised by her great prosperity above all that ordinary mortals fear and reverence. She was rich and nobly born and powerful. 7 sons had been born to her, brave and beautiful young men, and 7 daughters, the fairest of the fair. She thought herself strong enough not only to deceive the gods, as her father had tried to do, but to defy them openly. She called upon the people of Thebes to worship her. "You burn incense to Leto," she said, "and what is she as compared with me? She had but 2 children, Apollo and Artemis. I have 7 times as many. I am queen." She was a homeless wanderer until tiny Delos alone, of all places on earth, consented to receive her. "I am happy, strong, great, too great for any men or gods to do me harm. Make your sacrifices to me in Leto's temple, mine now, not hers." Insolent words uttered in the arrogant consciousness of power were always heard in heaven and always punished. Apollo and Artemis glided swiftly to Thebes from Olympus, the archer god and the divine huntress, and shooting with deadly aim, they struck down all of Niobe's sons and daughters. She saw them die with anguish too great for expression. Beside those bodies so lately young and strong, she sank down motionless in stony grief, dumb as a stone, and her heart like a stone within her. Only her tears flowed and could not stop. She was changed into a stone which forever, night and day, was wet with tears. To Pelops 2 sons were born, Atreus and Thyestes. The inheritance of evil descended to them in full force. Thyestes fell in love with his brother's wife and succeeded in making her false to her marriage vows. Atreus found out and swore that Thyestes should pay as no man ever had. He killed his brother's 2 little children and had them cut limb from limb, boiled and served up to their father. When he had eaten, poor wretch, when he had learned the deed abhorrent, he cried a great cry, falling back, spewed out, "That flesh called down upon that house a doom. Intolerable, the banquet board sent crashing. Atreus was king. Thyestes had no power. The atrocious crime was not avenged in Atreus's lifetime, but his children and his children's children suffered. Agamemnon and his children. On Olympus, the gods were met in full assembly. The father of gods and men began to speak. Zeus was sorely vexed at the mean way men perpetually acted toward the gods, blaming the divine powers for what their own wickedness brought about, and that too even when the Olympians had tried to hold them back. You will know about Aegisthus, whom Agamemnon's son Orestes had slain. Zeus said, how he loved the wife of Agamemnon and killed him on his return from Troy. Certainly no blame attaches to us from that. We warned him by the mouth of Hermes. The death of the son of Atreus will be avenged by Orestes. Those were Hermes' very words. But not even such friendly advice could restrain Aegisthus, who now pays the final penalty. This passage in the Iliad is the first mention of the House of Atreus. In the Odyssey, when Odysseus reaches the land of the Phaeacians and was telling them about his descent to Hades and the ghost he encountered, he said that of them all, the spirit of Agamemnon had most moved him to pity. He had begged him to say how he died, and the chief told him that he was killed ingloriously as he sat at table, struck down as one butchers an ox. I was Aegisthus, he said, and with the aid of my accursed wife. He invited me to his house, and as I feasted, he killed me. My men, too. You have seen many die in single combat or in battle, but never one who died as we did. By the wine bowl and the loaded tables in a hall where the floor flowed with blood. Clytemnestra slew her over my body. I tried to life up my hands for her, but they fell back. I was dying then. That was the way the story was first told. Agamemnon had been killed by his wife's lover. It was a sordid tale. How long it held the stage we do not know, but the next account we have, centuries later, written by Aeschylus about 450 BC, is very different. It is the great story of now implacable vengeance and tragic passions and inevitable doom. The motive for Agamemnon's death is no longer the guilty love of a man and a woman, but a mother's love for her daughter killed by her own father, and a wife's determination to avenge that death by killing her husband. Aegisthus fades. He is hardly in the picture. The wife of Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, has all the foreground to herself. The two sons of Atreus, Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek forces at Troy, and Menelaus, the husband of Helen, ended their lives very differently. Menelaus at first was less successful. The less successful was notably prosperous in his later years. He lost his wife for a time, but after the fall of Troy, he got her back. His ship was driven all the way to Egypt by the storm Athena set out to the Greek fleet, but finally he reached home safely and lived happily with Helen ever after. It was far otherwise with his brother. When Troy fell, Agamemnon was the most fortunate of the victorious chieftains. His ship came safely through the storm, which wrecked and drove to distant countries so many others. He entered his city not only safe after peril by land and sea, but triumphant, the proud conqueror of Troy. His home was expecting him. Word had been sent that he had landed, and the townspeople joined in a great welcome to him. It seemed that he was of all men the most gloriously successful after a brilliant victory, back with his own again, peace and prosperity before him. But in the crowd that greeted him with thanksgiving for his return, there were anxious faces, and words of dark foreboding passed from one man to another. "He will find evil happenings," they muttered. "Things once were right there in the palace, but no more. That house could tell a tale if it could speak." Before the palace, the elders of the city were gathered to do their king honor, but they too were in distress with a still heavier anxiety, a darker foreboding than that which weighed upon the doubtful crowd. As they waited, they talked in low tones of the past. They were owed, and it was almost more real to them than the present. They recalled the sacrifice of Iphigenia, lovely, innocent young thing, trusting her father utterly, and men confronted with the altar, the cruel knives, and only pitiless faces around her. As the old men spoke, it was like a vivid memory to them, and as if they themselves had been there, as if they had heard with her the father she loved telling men to lift her and hold her over the altar to slay her. He had killed her, not willingly, but driven by the army impatient for good winds to sail to Troy. And yet the matter was not as simple as that. He yielded to the army because the old wickedness in generation after generation of his race was bound to work out in evil for him too. The elders knew the curse that hung over the house. The thirst for blood, it is in their flesh. Before the old wound can be healed, there is fresh blood flowing. 10 years had passed since Iphigenia died, but the results of her death reached through to the present. The elders were wise. They had learned that every sin causes fresh sin. Every wrong brings another in its train. A menace from the dead girl hung over her father in his hour of triumph. And yet, perhaps, they said to each other, perhaps it would not take actual shape for a time. So they tried to find some bit of hope. But at the bottom of their hearts, they knew and dared not say aloud that vengeance was already there in the palace waiting for Agamemnon. It had waited ever since the queen Clytemnestra had come back from Aulis, where she had seen her daughter die. She did not keep faith with her husband, who had killed her child and his. He took a lover, and all the people knew it. They too knew that she had not sent him away when the news of Agamemnon's return reached her. He was still there with her. What was being planned behind the palace doors? As they wondered and feared, a tumult of noise reached them. Chariots rolling, voices shouting. Into the courtyard swept the royal car with the king, and beside him a girl, very beautiful, but very strange looking. Attendants and townspeople were following them as they came to a halt. The doors of the great house swung open and the queen appeared. The king dismounted, praying aloud, "O victory now mine, be mine forever." His wife advanced to meet him. Her face was radiant, her head high. She knew that every man there except Agamemnon was aware of her infidelity, but she faced them all and told them with smiling lips that even in their presence she must at such a moment speak out the great love she bore her husband and the agonizing grief she had suffered in his absence. Then in words of exultant joy she bade him welcome. "You are our safety," she told him, "our sure defense. The sight of you is dear as land after storm to the sailor, as a gushing stream to a thirsty wayfarer." He answered her, but with reserve, and he turned to go into the palace. First he pointed to the girl in the chariot. She was Cassandra, Priam's daughter, he told his wife, the army's gift to him, the flower of all the captive women. Let Clytemnestra see to her and treat her well. With that he entered the house, and the doors closed behind the husband and the wife. They would never again open for both of them. The crowd had gone. Only the old men still waited uneasily before the silent building and the blank doors. The captive princess caught their attention, and they looked curiously at her. They had heard of her strange fame as a prophetess whom no one ever believed, and yet whose prophecies were always proved true by the event. She turned a terrified face to them. Where had she been brought? She asked them wildly. What house was this? They answered soothingly that it was where the son of Atreus lived. She cried out, "No! It is a house God hates, where men are killed and the floor is red with blood." The old men stole frightened glances at each other. Blood, men killed. That was what they too were thinking of. The dark past with its promise of more darkness. How could she, a stranger and a foreigner, know that past? "I hear the children crying," she wailed. "Crying for wounds that bleed. A father feasted and the flesh of his children. Thyestes and his sons." Where had she heard of that? More wild words poured from her lips. It seemed as if she had seen what had happened in that house through the years, as if she stood by while death followed death, each a crime and all working together to produce more crime. Then from the past she turned to the future. She cried out that on that very day 2 more deaths would be added to the list. One her own. "I will endure to die," she said, as she turned away and moved toward the palace. They tried to hold her back from that ominous house, but she would not have it. She entered, and the doors closed forever on her, too. The silence that followed when she had gone suddenly and terribly broken. A cry rang out, the voice of a man in agony. God, I am struck, my death blow. And silence again. The old men, terrified, bewildered, huddled together. That was the king's voice. What should they do? Break into the palace? Quick! Be quick, they urged each other. We must know! But there was no need now of any violence. The doors opened, and on the threshold stood the queen. Dark red stains were on her dress, her hands, her face, yet she herself looked unshaken, strongly sure of herself. She proclaimed for all to hear that it had been done. Here lies my husband dead, struck down justly by my hand, she said. It was his blood that stained her dress and face, and she was glad. He fell, and as he gasped, his blood spouted and splashed me with dark spray, a dew of death sweet to me as heaven's sweet raindrops when the cornland buds. She saw no reason to explain her act or excuse it. She was not a murderer in her own eyes, but was an executioner. She had punished a murderer, the murderer of his own child, who cared no more than if a beast should die when flocks are plenty in the fleecy fold, but slew his daughter, slew her for a charm against the Thracian winds. Her lover followed her and stood beside her. Aegisthus, the young child of Thyestes, born after that horrible feast. He had no quarrel with Agamemnon himself, but Atreus, who had the children slaughtered and placed on the banquet table for their father, was dead, and vengeance could not reach him. Therefore his son must pay the penalty. The two, the queen and her lover, had reason to know that wickedness cannot be ended by wickedness. The dead body of the man they had just killed was a proof. But in their triumph, they did not stop to think that his death too, like all the others, would surely bring evil in its train. No more blood for you and me, Clytemnestra said to Aegisthus. We are the lords here now. We too will order all things well. It was a baseless hope. Iphigenia had been one of 3 children. The other 2 were a girl and a boy, Electra and Orestes. Aegisthus would certainly have killed the boy if Orestes had been there, but he had been sent away to a trusted friend. The girl Aegisthus disdained to kill. He only made her utterly wretched in every way possible until her whole life was concentrated in one hope, that Orestes would come back and avenge their father. That vengeance, what would it be? Over and over she asked herself this. Aegisthus, of course, must die, but to kill him alone would never satisfy justice. His crime was less black than mother's. What then could it be justice that a son should take a mother's life to avenge a father's death? So she brooded through the bitter days of the long years that followed, while Clytemnestra and Aegisthus ruled the land. As the boy grew to manhood, he saw even more clearly that than she the terrible situation. It was a son's duty to kill his father's murderers, a duty that came before all others. But a son who killed his mother was abhorrent to gods and to men. A most sacred obligation was bound up with a most atrocious crime. He who wanted only to do right and so placed that he must choose between two hideous wrongs. He must be a traitor to his father, or he must be a murderer of his mother. In his agony of doubt, he journeyed to Delphi to ask the oracle to help him. And Apollo spoke to him in clear words, bidding him slay the two who slew, atone for death by death, shed blood for old blood shed. And Orestes knew that he must work out the curse of his house, exact vengeance and pay with his own ruin. He went to the home he had not seen since he was a little boy, and with him went his cousin and friend Pylades. The two had grown up together and were devoted in a way far beyond usual friendship. Electra, with no idea that they were actually arriving, was yet on the watch. Her life was spent in watching for the brother who would bring her the only thing life held for her. One day, at her father's tomb, she made an offering to the dead and prayed, "O Father, guide Orestes to his home." Suddenly he was beside her, claiming her as his sister, showing her as proof the cloak he wore, the work of her hands, which she had wrapped him in when he went away. But she did not need a proof. She cried, "Your face is my father's face." And she poured out to him all the love no one had wanted from her through the wretched years. All is yours. The love I owed my father who is dead, the love I might have given to my mother, and my poor sister cruelly doomed to die. All yours now, only yours. He was too sunk in his own thought, too intent upon the thing he faced, to answer her or even to listen. He broke in upon her words to tell her what filled his mind so that nothing else could reach it. The terrible words of the oracle of Apollo. Orestes spoke with horror. He told me to appease the angry dead, that who hears not when his dead cry to him. For such there is no home, no refuge anywhere. No altar fire burns for him, no friend greets him. He dies alone and vile. O God, shall I believe such oracles? But yet, the deed is to be done, and I must do it. The three made their plans. Orestes and Pylades were to go to the palace, claiming to be the bearers of a message that Orestes had died. It would be joyful news to Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, who had always feared what he might do, and would certainly want to see the messengers. Once in the palace, the brother and his friend could trust to their own swords and the complete surprise of their attack. They were admitted and electrocuted. That had been her bitter part all through her life. Then the doors opened slowly, and a woman came out and stood tranquilly on the steps. It was Clytemnestra, she had been there only a moment or so, when a slave rushed out screaming, "Treason! Our master! Treason!" He saw Clytemnestra and gasped, "Orestes! Alive! Here!" She knew then. Everything was clear to her, what had happened and what was still to come. Sternly she bade the slave bring her a battle axe. She was resolved to fight for her life, and the weapon was no sooner in her hand than she changed her mind. A man came through the doors with sword red with blood, whose blood she knew, and she knew too who held the sword. Instantly she saw a surer way to defend herself than with an axe. She was the mother of the man before her. "Stop, my son," she said. "Look, my breast, your heavy head dropped on it, and you slept, oh, many a time. Your baby mouth, where never a tooth was, sucked the milk, and so you grew." Orestes cried, "Oh, Pylades, she is my mother. May I spare?" His friend told him solemnly, "No. Apollo had commanded. The god must be obeyed." "I will obey," Orestes said. "You, follow me." Clytemnestra knew that she had lost. She said calmly, "It seems, my son, that you will kill your mother." He motioned her into the house. She went, and he followed. When he came out again, those waiting in the courtyard did not need to be told what he had done. Asking no questions, they watched him, their master now, with compassion. He seemed not to see them. He was looking at a horror beyond them. Stammering words came from his lips. "The man is dead. I am not guilty there. An adulterer. He had to die. But did she do it, or did she not? Oh, you, my friends, I say I killed my mother, yet without reason. She was vile, and she killed my father, and God hated her." His eyes were fixed always on that unseen horror. He screamed, "Look! Look! Women there, black, all black, and the long hair like snakes." They told him eagerly there were no women. "It is only your fancy. Oh, do not fear. You do not see them," he cried. "No fancy. I see them. My mother has sent them. They crowd around me, and their eyes drip blood. Oh, let me go." He rushed away alone except for those invisible companions. When next he came to his country, years had passed. He had been a wanderer in many lands, always pursued by the same terrible shapes. He was worn with suffering, but in his loss of everything men prize, there was a gain too. "I have been taught by misery," he said. He had learned that no crime was beyond atonement, that even he, defiled by a mother's murder, should be made clean again. He traveled to Athens, sent there by Apollo, to plead his case before Athena. He had come to beg for help. Nevertheless, in his heart there was confidence. Those who desire to be purified cannot be refused, and the black stain of his guilt had grown fainter and fainter through the years of lonely wandering and pain. He believed that by now it had faded away. I can speak to Athena with pure lips, he said. The goddess listened to his plea. Apollo was beside him. It is I who am answerable for what he did, he said. He killed at my command. The dread forms of his pursuers, the Erinyes, the Furies, were arrayed against him, but Orestes listened calmly to their demand for vengeance. I, not Apollo, was guilty of my mother's murder, he said, but I have been cleansed of my guilt. These were words never spoken before by any of the House of Atreus. The killers of that race had never suffered from their guilt and sought to be made clean. Athena accepted the plea. She persuaded the avenging goddesses also to accept it, and with the new law of mercy established, they themselves were changed. From the Furies of frightful aspect, they became the benignant or benignant ones, the Eumenides, the protectors of the suppliant. They acquitted Orestes, and with the words of acquittal, the spirit of evil which had haunted his house for so long was banished. Orestes went forth from Athena's tribunal a free man. Neither he nor any descendant of his would ever again be driven into evil by the irresistible power of the past. The curse of the House of Atreus was ended. So yeah, we'll end this episode here. There's still more to this House of Atreus. We'll be looking at Iphigenia and the Taurians. Does it have any other stories remaining? We're looking through the pages. Okay, that's the last story in the House of Atreus, which we know Iphigenia was sacrificed by Agamemnon, so it's an earlier evil. Orestes is the one who gets rid of the evil curse that had been placed upon the house. So, yeah. It's, yeah. The House of Atreus and his descendants would be cursed for quite a while, although it technically started under one of their predecessors, Tantalus, who was a favorite of the gods, being Zeus's son, but he was so arrogant and filled with hatred toward his relatives that he would serve them a feast of human flesh. And they're like, no. We know what you have done. And so he would remain in Hades in the pool. They talked about the fact that he was always tantalized. You know, he couldn't leave the pool, but water was right there. No matter how thirsty he became, he would try to lean down and drink, and the water would go, making sure he could get nigh a drop of it. And then, of course, there was so much fruit hanging from above that it seemed like he could just reach and grab it to sate his hunger. But no. That was to be kept from him too. The winds would blow and cause the branches to sway out of his reach. So it's like, you want to give us a feast of human, then you shall always see the option to eat and drink, but never consume. And of course, we have the word tantalized now. Tantalized, tantalized. So yeah. Anyway. Agamemnon, one of the more famous members of the family, especially because of the Trojan War, would end up killing his own daughter. And so it would continue the curse of Atreus. So you had what? 1, 2, 3, 4 generations from Tantalus to Orestes. So yeah. Yeah. But next episode we'll finish up the House of Atreus. Like I said, it's just got that one little story left, Iphigenia and the Taurians. And then we'll be getting into a new house. But, as always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next. Until then, later.